Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special meeting of the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission. Today, it's our honor and privilege to interview our two finalists for the position of the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. We have several folks who are able to join us remotely and observe the interviews, and we're very glad that you are able to join us today and be a part of this very important process. As we begin every meeting, I like to remind myself and everybody what it is that we're doing here. And DEQ's mission is to be a leader in restoring, maintaining, and enhancing the quality of Oregon's air, land, and water. So we, of course, are going to be keeping that close in mind as we conduct all our business, both today and tomorrow. Also, as we begin, I want to let the record show that all the commissioners are present, and we have a very specific agenda for this meeting that has to do with interviews and decision-making for the director position. And as we begin, a few logistics for everyone. So this interview is scheduled for up to 75 minutes. When 10 minutes remain, a slide will be shown on the screen noting that time check. And a second slide will be shown when 5 minutes remain. And today, the commission is going to ask the same question of both finalists. And I'd like to introduce to everybody our candidate before us now, Jamie McLeod-Skinner. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you so much.
And with that, Jamie, do you have any questions for the commission before we begin?
Not at all. Just really delighted to be here and really appreciate you starting with the mission of the organization. It's what we're all passionate about. So excited to have this conversation about it.
That sounds great. So glad to hear it. And so we're going to kind of take a traditional rotation approach here. I'll start with the questions and then we're just going to kind of rotate around the table. So our first question, what would be your approach to leading within an organization that is on the precipice of transformational change toward an organization defined by diversity, inclusivity, equity, and justice?
Well, first, you have to set the stage for success. There's an incredible team that is already in place, and making sure that it's understanding any barriers or fears or challenges that are anticipated as part of that change is first and foremost, because it's really about respecting the team and helping the team go through that change. And change is sometimes exciting for some folks and more difficult or challenging or fearful for others. So respecting people who are at, honoring their pride in their work, and then rewarding positive change, I think are really key steps in that. I'm really excited that the organization already has outcome-based management. I've actually worked in organizational effectiveness and helping organizations transition to outcomes-based management. What's really important in that type of process is making sure your measures will actually measure the change you want to see, that organizational change. So it's not simply about attending meetings. It's not simply about setting up kind of remote trainings or even having someone review your policies. Those are all really important, but helping to determine the change you want to see. And part of that also comes back to you all to make sure that there's clarity around what that change means to you. Because when we look at that goal and that aspirational goal and that really important goal that we must accomplish to serve all Oregonians, it's really important to understand expectations, what that looks like, and set that stage, because that's also a fairness component for the team, to make sure the team knows what those expectations are and has the support to move forward in those expectations. That's where I think having fresh eyes and someone with experience doing this type of work is really valuable. And I've got experience doing this type of work, working with teams, helping teams see the value in leaning into serving all our customers, both our internal customers and external customers as well, building up and building on those relationships, statewide relationships. As part of this process, part of my homework, I reached out to partners across the state and talked to organizations that are especially interested in the DEI and the environmental justice component, and heard from them some of their perspectives on what DEQ is doing well, and some of those, what I call opportunities for improvement, which is part of that Baldrige model of organizational change. That was part of the study I had. So having that understanding, getting to know the team, and it's both setting the stage overall for the entire team and the entire organization, setting those expectations, but also working with individuals and building up those relationships and getting an understanding of what the actual barriers are. Because I really believe that people have so much pride in their work and want to do their work well. And sometimes efforts especially around DEI and my work on OWEB. We're doing this work as a board right now. You know, seeing what the barriers are and helping people lean into that. And then we all make mistakes. We all struggle with overcoming these types of barriers. And so if someone feels like they're falling, help them to fall forward, help it to be a learning experience, help it to not be a negative experience. I remember when my wife and I got married, my uncle, who comes from a very conservative perspective, asked me, what should I call you now? And I really, really appreciated that. It was such a kindness from him, but he was also trying to understand what that language is like. And I thought that was really bold and courageous of him and really kind of him. And so helping people, again, establish an understanding expectation. So setting that as the overall expectation, being really clear that that's where we're going. And then working with people as a group and individually to help figure out where those barriers are, overcome them, and move forward. But again, one of my first things would be to come back and ask you, what does that look like to you? And also sharing what I think some of those measures should be, to say what I think that looks like. And then also, very importantly, knowing what the community feels like, what Oregonians think that looks like. And that's with our community partners. I've already started some of those conversations with folks, again, statewide. We're here in Portland right now, and Portland is driver for the state, but also being someone who lives in a rural area, there's often the sense that rural areas and a lot of communities are overlooked. So understanding that perspective, I think, is critical to actually defining what that looks like. Because we want to get to the point where all Oregonians feel served by the organization and feel like partners in helping to protect our air, land, and water.
Thank you.
So I could ask the second question, Jamie, which is, what is your experience communicating environmental regulatory information to elected or appointed officials at government levels, impacted community members, and regulated entities?
Well, I have experience as staff, as a manager and a leader, and then also as a policymaker. And just before talking about some of those experiences, I do think it's important to know your audience and understand both their perspective and where they're coming from, but also where they are at. I mean, this is true for the previous question as well. If you want to see change, know where someone's at. If you want to speak to an audience, know where they're at. And I actually do a training I've done quite frequently about bridging divides. And it's really thinking of it as almost different languages. So as policymakers, you're doing 15 million different things. You have time and energy for this work, but also you have your professional background, professional perspective. And so understanding that about each of you or whoever the audience is really important, because you speak in a language, this is true of DEI work as well, people speak in a language that's sometimes heard and sometimes not heard. This is part of the root, I think, of our divides, whether they're political divides, whether they're urban-rural divides. So having that understanding is critically important. So as staff, when I worked as a planner, as a city planner, and as an environmental planner, communicating, especially at policymakers, to members of the community, I worked on things like developing a citywide solar plan. So first going out, talking to the community, understanding some of the community concerns, again, the expectations of the council and the policymakers was really critical to developing work and then also presenting work before them. As a manager, you are in between that staff component and provide for your team, as well as the public and the community and the policymakers. So understanding, again, where people are at and making those presentations. When I worked as interim city manager in talent, helping the city rebound from the wildfire, and the city was decimated by the 2020 wildfires, lost a third of its businesses and homes. And being able to understand expectations and then communicate to the policymakers, also to the community. In that case, a lot of the folks who were impacted, their homes were impacted, were seniors on fixed income and farm workers. And so being able to effectively communicate with the public meant making sure that we had translation of documents and interpretation in our meetings. So a city of less than 5,000, I brought someone in who was known and respected in the community and had that public trust, who could connect with community, especially the farm worker community, in ways that the city, with all its good intent, had not been able to before, because there are barriers between government and communities, especially vulnerable communities, especially communities that have been overlooked or have fear of government. So understanding again who your audience is, what some of those barriers are, being able to have the relationships in place. In my case, I was very fortunate. I have really good friends who have led Unite for years and Northwest seasonal workers. So I could reach out to the directors of those organizations and they invited me in to sit down in their office, showing up at someone else's site, listening with respect, understanding perspectives. That's how you learn how to do it. So you can never go in with the mindset of knowing, when you're trying to communicate, assuming that you know everything already. You have to understand where your audience is at to be able to effectively communicate. And that's again where I think, my relationships across the state in all 36 counties is really critically important, but also relationships regionally with key policymakers and leaders in neighboring states, some at the federal level with our delegation and with others who serve, in Congress, to be able to know what their interests are, what they're trying to accomplish. That's really key. Something else I did as a policymaker is, this is when I served on a city council, is there were I chaired a regional solid waste reduction commission. And a lot of the cities were interested in addressing single-use bags and the waste and the impact on sewers and all. And so I worked with those who were excited about change and not excited about change to hear their perspectives, bring them in, build up those partnerships, and try to find a path forward to address that issue that incorporated the insight and perspective of all those leaders. And I was actually able to lead. We developed a policy that cities adopted around making change that also incorporated an initial period of voluntary compliance that allowed potentially organizations to step up, because that was a big ask of some of those opposed to it moving forward. And we incorporated their input. So as a policymaker, as a manager of an organization, and again, as staff, I've worked on this. And again, going out and presenting, you all know I've run for office, but when I've gone out and not only met communities, but also presented myself to tribal communities. I've done that before. And it's a show of respect. It's a way to listen and learn. It's a way to show accessibility. Because if we're really looking at really strengthening partnerships and building up these relationships, we have to show up. We have to listen. And that's communicating starts with listening and learning. And then you can understand how to communicate most effectively. And then also, it's got to be about where people are at. What's kind of funny in this conversation I've had from some folks is a lot of people, because of the communication I've had in the past, don't understand how extensive my environmental background is, because it's not about me, it's about them when I show up. And sometimes the extensive background I have is a barrier in some places, so I don't talk about it, because my goal is to be able to communicate effectively.
Okay, I'm up next. So, Jamie, as you know, Oregon's a big state. DEQ's headquarters is here at the population center of the Valley. But the footprint and the impact that he does is all corners of the state. So what are some strategies, skills, or tools that you would use to ensure your accessibility and responsiveness to stakeholders and partners? Describe your approach to engagement with rural and urban communities.
Well, actually, as you and I both know, living in rural, you in southern and myself in central Oregon, rural central Oregon, this is an issue and concern, and a lot of tribal communities as well have this concern statewide. So I spoke a little bit to this in my earlier response, but the showing up piece is critically important. Understanding perspectives, people want to feel heard. And that's the biggest frustration I've heard from folks from BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, as well as from rural communities. Understanding that the work of DEQ, the wonderful thing is that it touches every single life in Oregon. It sets a stage for clean air and clean water and protecting our land for current and future generations. It's such a great scope of work. And understanding that from the perspective of those who there's some folks who lean into that mission. There's some folks who feel that who feel a bit pressured and threatened by that mission. And so trying to build partnerships, I'm a big believer in having and conversations, not or conversations. So it's not about the environment versus business. It's, and I'll give you a perfect example of that. When I served in a policymaker role, there was a concern of, as we all have, as the mission of DEQ, is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And number one, of course, transportation. Number two, where I was around development. And so what we did, and so there's an interest in green building solutions. There's also LEED, there's a couple different standards that are out there, but incorporating that more into development. Well, just as simply establishing more regulation was going to get pushback from developers. So we sat down with developers and said, this is an interest moving forward. What is a barrier you're seeing around cities? And in that location, in that county, there were 15 cities all close together, similar to the Portland metro area. We have multiple cities. I mean, Portland is the biggest one, but there's multiple cities all around Portland. And developers were saying their biggest frustration was very different planning processes for all the different cities. In their mind, they wanted to move forward. This was a barrier or frustration for them. And so he said, okay, let's develop a partnership. And I co-found a group of policymakers and staff and planners to sit down, developers, sit down and say, what are our common interests here? And how can we work together on creating a solution? And developers were saying, look, if you can work on standardizing the process, we're fine with some of these other costs. We pass it along to our consumer essentially, but we want consistency in government. We want to understand where government's coming from. That's what I've heard mostly from the business sector, understanding the standards. There's another piece as well that I'll speak to, but we, so we sat down, we established a process, and it was actually a 3-tiered because the cities all had different approaches. Some were much more leaned into establishing regulations. Some wanted to make it optional. We established a 3-tier process of incorporating incorporating green building standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we actually got developers to support it. They were really excited about it. So it went, and the cities adopted one of those 3 tiers. The net benefit was a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but it was also a huge benefit, and it built relationships and built this sense of common purpose, which is part of the challenge that's before Oregon right now. So the other piece of that, though, and it's in place right now, but I think the compliance first and then enforcement. But I think there's another opportunity to have in between those 2 steps an assessment piece of why not, if there's not compliance, why not? And especially smaller communities. And I say this having led, small communities or nonprofits as well. There are barriers that people face. Some folks don't want to comply and want to pay that's just the approach they're going to take. That's fine. That's an approach. But if we have partners who are leaning into and wanting to protect the resources and wanting to comply, is there a step that we can take to help them? And again, we also right now have some funding programs. We have other opportunities to help support that. But let's make sure we have that conversation before simply stepping into the enforcement. And let me be very clear that the standard is set. This is not a matter of stepping back from the standard. The standard is really clear of what we have to accomplish. But we can have an and conversation about figuring out if there are barriers. How do we work in partnership with those who we are regulating to make sure that we're being good partners? Because let's give folks the benefit of the doubt first off. While we hold fast to the standards, let's provide that opportunity for folks to comply and get the support they need if they're not there yet.
Thank you. What strategies have you used in previous positions to help engage a large workforce made up of many different disciplines? And how would those strategies apply to DEQ with its varied programs and expertise? How do you ensure strong employee retention?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, support the team, support people doing good work. That's critically important. And in terms of those different, a diverse workforce, this is where I think my background in engineering and in planning and in law really play into it, because just like different communities speak different languages, professions speak different languages. And so, understanding the perspective of someone who is working in rural communities, trying to help with compliance on septic systems, for example. Having that background, I actually my colleagues, I began my public service over in Bosnia and Kosovo, helping to repair schools and hospitals after the war. And one of the steps, one of the things we had in Kosovo was septic systems running over playing fields. And I actually worked with my colleagues to help develop leach fields and design them, and went through that. And that was the engineering side. And folks there actually said, I don't know if this is true, but the engineers I worked with said I introduced leach fields to Kosovo. When I was driving over yesterday from Central Oregon and stopped by in Detroit and was grabbing lunch, I was hearing folks who are trying to rebuild after the fire talk about some of the challenges they're having around septic systems. And what an opportunity. And they had this great idea about a partnership with ODOT and some, that's a more detailed conversation, but showing up, listening, understanding some of those barriers and working with folks to overcome that. We have folks out in the field doing that, having an understanding of that field, having an understanding of the legal side. When I went back to school and got my law degree, I focused on water law and Indian law, understanding those different perspectives, understanding on the planning side and the community engagement side. So it starts again with understanding and then setting a tone for the entire organization and supporting people in doing their work. But as a leader, you're setting the vision specific to this role, because this role is not about doing that work. This role is about those external partnerships. This and building the bridge between the great work that staff does and then also external partners. So that piece is work I've done extensively throughout the state, but helping to make that connection between the work that DEQ staff, the great work they're already doing, rewarding that work, keep doing what we're doing well, and also look for those opportunities for improvement, and also explore those in a way that's not threatening to folks to be able to move forward. In terms of retention, this goes back to when I was working in environmental organizational effectiveness. Their work, employee recognition, work on, employee resource groups. I led an ERG back when I worked as an environmental planner for a regional water agency, making sure that people feel respect in their role, feel supported in their role, making sure that the value of their work is seen and they understand that value is being seen. So communicating to you all, communicating to the public, we can all be sitting here in this room but it's really the face of the organization are those folks who are out in the field. And so while I would be based here in Portland, I would also work to travel around the state to make sure I was understanding the issues of our teams out in the field and making sure that they felt the support of headquarters out in the field and that realizing that, it's different to have a conversation here in this room versus the conversation that DEQ staff in Pendleton and Medford are having with our customers, our external customers. And so learning from our team how they can be better supported. I mean, it all starts with listening and understanding where people are at. And then also setting those outcome measures that both achieve the overall goals of the agency, but also recognize the support, the team feeling supported in doing that work. And the fact of the matter now with change, and especially with other change that's coming, we're talking about the DEI and leaning into that, it's, everyone's come through COVID. There's been different, changes within government. We have a new governor. So making sure we're tapping down on the fear of change and the fear of too much coming in, make sure people feel supported. That's a really key first step. DEQ staff are doing amazing work protecting our natural resources. Making sure that's respected and that's supported is critically important. And then just lastly, I was actually reading through the agreement with AFSCME, making sure there's a strong relationship with our labor partners. That's work I've done before. I was actually AFSCME myself when I worked as an environmental planner. I would plan on meeting with the representative, once a month, just to stay engaged, ears to the ground, make sure I was understanding both from an organizational standpoint where our workforce is coming from, but also those individual relationships as well.
Just trying to think through. If I can just have a follow-up to the last question.
Yeah.
As you're talking about supporting, what is a 300 member staff and then some, and I appreciate that example with AFSCME and connecting monthly. What are some other specific strategies you could employ to help staff feel supported, given your role and the fact that there's a range of staff, and just what are some specific things you could do to
Well, so communicating externally to partners in providing support for the work they do. Your role as a director is to really be that interface between staff and policymakers. If there's tension between the policies you all lay out and staff, understanding that and being able to communicate that back to you as well, so that you understand that. And then also coming up with strategies to be able to move forward so that staff feel supported in doing that work. So the listening piece, engaging, the hearing what's coming in and figuring out what rises up to you all, what actually is also a conversation with the public. I mean, some of those tensions will be different. Some folks may not feel supported within the organization. Understanding that and seeing what can be done to change that is critically important. When people do leave the organization, making sure you're hearing from that and having those debriefs to understand why. Making sure you're creating also a support environment. And frankly, this is especially true because Oregon is not a very diverse state with our more diverse staff. So tonight, for example, I'm going to go to the Say Hey event. The Say Hey event is about providing support for the BIPOC community and folks newly arrived to the state, but also support for folks within the community. There's certain things that I have a sense of now, there's certain things that I can guess at, but you really have to ask individuals and get that feedback to understand what it means to them. Because again, we can all agree this is a good concept, but what may be true to us may be different from someone's individual experience. But also creating a safe and supportive work environment. I've been in this situation before where I stepped into an organization that staff were feeling very threatened by people within the structure. It was something I worked to address. I ended up getting punished for it. But it was something that I felt really strongly about. And this is true of folks in the community, more diverse folks in the community who are feeling threatened by the role government was taking or not taking. It was also within the organization itself. And there was someone I shared with HR, a letter that was shared by someone I worked with before who was actually in that situation specifically, and talked about how I really created a professional and supportive environment that she felt created safe space for her. And I think that kind of piece is really important. So of course, it needs to be a safe space and a supportive environment, but it also, whether it is looking at employee resource groups, and we have some statewide, but there's also what can be within the organization itself. Engagement and the listening piece, the staying involved, and also setting internal measures, those outcome-based measures that will actually set the challenge for those of us in management to make sure we're being responsive to the concerns that are raised. And so often, I mentioned this before, in outcome-based management, you often see measures set up that are boxes you can check, but don't actually capture organizational change. One perfect example of this that's going to be coming is the environmental justice group. So there was a request for 2 staff. The governor, because it's part of her priorities as well, fortunately include that in her agenda and in her budget. But what we've seen, and this goes back to the first question, what we often see is people being put in positions of responsibility without authority. And if people are not supported in doing their work, you're setting them up to fail. Understanding those dynamics and setting the stage so people can be supported in their work is critically important. And again, I do appreciate it's more of a general response, but open door policy, ethics and integrity in work, and those are things that are very, very important to me. And so helping to create that supportive environment for the team is really important. And knowing that I would be working most closely with senior management, but also making sure that they're always, the door's always open for any DEQ staff. And again, showing up around the state and being present. There's sometimes different just sitting down with someone and grabbing a cup of coffee versus just taking a call or taking an email, but in terms of their experience. But being present is critically important, and listening.
Thank you. Appreciate you saying that. So I've got the next question as well.
And actually, if I can say, I've mentioned reading the agreement with AFSCME, honoring that agreement is really key as well. And if it's not being honored, to make sure that that happens.
All right. So what are some strategies, skills, and tools you use to critically analyze, weigh and balance the positions of internal staff, advocates, and industry?
Yeah, this is really the crux of a lot of DEQ's work and trying to both build those partnerships and staff feel supported. So it starts with knowing your overall goal and being very goal focused. And that is really the key driver. Getting out there and building relationships, I think, is really important. So understanding perspective. I think the other piece is being open to other ways of accomplishing the overall goal. And I think that's where government often trips over its own feet, in that there's a sense of, we figured out how to do it. From our perspective, this works. You must do this. And if we've got partners who say, I'm absolutely committed to this goal as well, and I will help to accomplish this goal, but it would be easier for me to do it this way, or I can't do it the way you've laid out. I need to decide. And yet we have AORs, we have rulemaking that lays out certain steps and procedures. But what is our level of flexibility to accomplish our overall goal and to work in partnership with those who come back to us and say, I can't do that, or that makes it more difficult for me to accomplish this. I think that level of listening and flexibility in relationships is really key. And again, it comes down to listening. It comes down to building the relationships and having the relationships statewide with folks in all sectors to be able to really hear some of those different ideas, encourage the team to do that and staff to do that, and really reward, positive change in the organization to be more responsive to our customers while achieving our same goal. And often people, when you talk about partnerships, you talk about that flexibility. Some people hear that is not standing true to the goal of, bottom line enforcing or requiring the standards to be met. There's no question that there's a commitment to that bottom line goal. But I do think, and this is some of the feedback I've heard from folks and talking to folks around the state, that they would just really appreciate if they had some different ideas on how they would like to do things, and would the organization be open to hearing that? And once that feedback comes in, of course, it's also sitting down with the team and saying, is this feasible? I mean, can we do this legally? Are we, communicate with DOJ and making sure that's something we can do? Do we have flexibility now within the way rulemaking has been laid out, or do we have to go into rulemaking again to explore modifying it to provide that flexibility? So those are some of the key pieces. I think I'd mentioned this before, that analysis piece between compliance and enforcement, that's where some of those conversations come in. That flexibility and that customer focused approach, I think is what the governor expects, and she's made that really clear of all state agencies. But thinking both internal and external customers and working with both to make sure we're accomplishing and achieving those goals. But it is an and conversation, not nor conversation. And that's in talking to some folks in business, especially, that's a lot of what I've heard is, and the bottom line is there are some organizations who are not going to want to make change, but to accomplish our overall goals, that's the way to do it. And actually one other piece I want to add to this, because I had raised this in chatting with the governor's team, we have a lot of opportunity here in Oregon with federal legislation, the IRA, the CHIPS Act, for some new business to come into the area. The big thing is chip manufacturing. That's really exciting economically for the state. There's a lot of folks in the environmental community who are really nervous about the impacts. And I can tell you, having worked in Silicon Valley, chip manufacturing, it needs clean water, and it creates, there's toxins in the waste that it creates. If we are a proactive partner in working with businesses coming in, we can work to make sure the systems that are established solve the problem before it happens. We don't want to see another Morrow County with the groundwater problems they're facing. We want to be working in partnership before the projects are done and before the impacts are being experienced. Those are some real opportunities, especially now, especially with federal resources that are coming in and businesses that are going to be created. It's a business-friendly model, and it's one of those and conversations. One of the frustrations I had as a planner, as environmental planners, often there would be, the project would be designed, and then planners would review it, and it was a sequential, not a parallel system. And I would often say, why don't we work in partnership as this is being developed to make sure we don't have some of the problems at the end? And some folks really leaned into that. Sometimes engineers would say, no, we've got to design first. As an engineer, I know that's not, you can actually work in partnership as you're developing. But we have some real opportunities, especially now here in Oregon, to both help strengthen our economy and make sure we're protecting our environment as we do it. So it gets into that, how we do it, not just what we do. And that's true for everything. It's true for our DEI work. It's how we do our work that is so critically important. And this is part of that how as well. I think there's tremendous opportunity at this time to make sure we are being good partners and seen as partners instead of waiting till there's problems and then creating conflict when some of those businesses won't then have the resources to re-engineer solutions. If we're in the forefront of this, and I think this is a conversation with our legislators as well, to help really lean into this, and some of our federal partners to be really clear of when you fund a project, let's make sure we're thinking, cradle to grave on this product, and how are we factoring in the environmental protections before they're a problem. That's something that I think is critically important. So we have long-term planning, we have some organizational change, but we also need to be thinking, years down the line and helping to create those solutions now.
Thank you. Back to me. So this question is in some ways has some relationship to the previous one, but also is a little bit distinct as well. DEQ, as you know, often faces situations where there are many competing interests at stake. What values in this question, what values would you rely on to help guide your decision-making in those situations?
Well, it starts again with understanding your overall goal, what you're trying to accomplish. And the values that drive that are fairness, are ethics, integrity. These are things that I have been true to my entire career, even sometimes at my own expense. But I think it sets the stage, it role models for your team. It helps to build public trust. When we're talking about design of new systems, we're talking about new industry, we're talking about industry that's having an impact on the environment now. We're talking about DEI work internally, environmental justice externally, urban-rural issues. It often comes down to the frustration with government, often comes down to the sense of fairness. Are you being fair? Are you understanding our perspective? Are you treating us fairly? The biggest, and again, speaking as someone who is based in rural Central Oregon, there's often this perception that those in Portland, with all due respect, are in a bit of a bubble because it is the power center of the state. And so having that outside perspective and having that sense of fairness. I serve on my volunteer roles is on Education Service District Board and ESD Board in rural Central Oregon. One of our school districts often has less than 10 kids. Their experience versus a very large school district is going to be dramatically different. And how do we make sure that they're treated fairly? That's a key thing. On DEI, people talk about DEI, environmental justice from many perspectives. My whole sense of what that means is just simply treating Oregonians fairly. It's being aware of historical injustices. It's being aware that there has been an unlevel playing field for a long time. But to me, that's simply leveling the playing field and acknowledging it. And it will feel a bit different to some folks because they're used to an unlevel playing field. But fairness, justice, integrity, stewardship. So some folks will talk about environmental protection. In rural areas, we often talk about stewardship. Farmers, those who live off the land, work land, have tremendous pride in their relationship with the land. And one of the top things I've heard from working with farmers is the sense that people don't think we respect the environment. Of course we do. How do we maintain our living? How do we pass our farm on to future generations? So that respect for Some of the language is used, but also that respect where people are at is critically important. And in the listening, the showing up piece and the listening with respect, there's a difference between, and it's so subtle, but a condescension in listening. You can sit there and kind of grit your teeth and hear what someone says, or you can really listen to what they're saying. And one of the things I found as a policymaker is sometimes, and you will all experience this too, you may have a lot of input from folks who feel very passionate from one side. And there may be just a few folks who bring in a different perspective and present differently. Because again, culturally across different cultures, be they urban, rural, be they different ethnic cultures, there's a different way to present. But if a really good idea comes up, if there's a fairness issue, hearing that equally is really important. And then again, it goes to the and not or conversations, but respect is fundamental to that.
Thank you.
And then I get the last question, Jamie.
May I ask you, so we go into this, can I just get a quick time check? Because I know I've got a longer period of time and
We're at 10:17. Oh, sorry. I jumped.
I apologize.
By all means, you are welcome to update the time
You
frame.
didn't have your clock.
I'm just,
And we started a little later than we intended to. So Stephanie, I'd like to actually go to you. How much do we have left?
Thank you, Chair George. You started approximately 5 minutes later than scheduled. So the end of this session would be at approximately 10:50. So just shy of 10:20. So approximately 1/2 an hour.
All right, doing very well.
well, then may I,
Yes.
I was concerned about getting through questions and may I then revisit and have an opportunity to go into some of the others either now or after I conclude the last question.
Yes, we can. This 75 minutes is for you
Okay,
to engage with these questions.
okay,
And so, yes, let's go ahead and proceed with the final question. And that will be true for both candidates.
Yeah.
So yes, if there's something that you'd like to go back to and hit another point, you're certainly welcome to do that. Like I said, these minutes are for you. And so let's let Commissioner Kyle give you the last question, and then you can certainly take a moment to look things over and see if you'd like to do some of that.
thank you. I just, I was trying to work on timeliness and make sure that I was, those, and also if there's any follow-up questions, I would really invite those as well.
Appreciate it. Yeah. So as we've kind of talked about, Oregon is a big state and it's a very diverse state and it's a very beautiful state. So what is your vision for DEQ's mission to protect, maintain, and enhance the quality of Oregon's air, land, and water, which is our mission statement?
Yeah, my vision would be that every Oregonian newly arrived and those who've been here since time immemorial, before Oregon was Oregon, to know that government is being a force for good. And often that can sometimes be questioned, the role of government, but that every Oregonian feels that DEQ is being part of a government agency that's being a force for good in safeguarding or being a good steward of our air, land, and water for current and future generations. And sometimes that through the direct work that DEQ does. Sometimes that's being a facilitator and enabling our partners and working with other natural resource agencies to support that work and sometimes to leverage other resources, quite frankly. And then also is just being an equal partner. So there's multiple roles that DEQ can take. Often folks will think of a government agency as just being within a very narrow bandwidth is just what that agency itself does. But I think through our relationships, I think through our partnerships, I think through our outreach, we can do so much more. And there's things that the other natural resource agencies are working on that are going to be critically important to be engaged in. There are things that wildfire preparedness. So the fact of the matter is we are facing a changing climate. And so our work on long-term vision to address climate issues and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to try to do that work with that long-term vision. But it's also preparing for the disasters that are here. My work in wildfire recovery in Southern Oregon and the work I've done also with the state in reaching out to partnerships and working in emergency preparedness is critically important. DEQ has a role in that. Partially, yes, because it impacts air quality, but also because it's part of that thinking ahead and being that thought partner on how we can be working together effectively with other state agencies, with also our partner agencies across the state. And that includes nonprofits. This is especially important in our DEI and environmental justice work, that we are engaging, listening to and learning from, and also engaging and supporting other organizations in being able to also work on our mission, getting the support they need to do that. We can be leveraging our resources. We can also be leveraging other resources to support them. And again, and learning from a lot of the conversations I've had with some of our potential partners and the growing partnerships across the state, I've heard both really positive, grateful things about the work that DEQ does, and really positive things said about our team, and identified some of those opportunities for improvement. What are some of the ways from their perspective that DEQ can be more present, can show up, can be understanding issues from their perspective? So, when we think about air quality issues, we're hearing this a lot in the Portland metro area, but really throughout our state. There are issues that farm workers are facing that have raised before, and I received feedback on, there were times those issues were raised, and perhaps we didn't have some of the mechanisms in place to be as responsive. Let's get them in place, because that's part of our job. If we really take a big step back and look at that big picture vision of what we want to accomplish, we can only accomplish that in partnership. Yes, with state agencies, but also with all Oregonians. So I would, my vision would be to have that set as a challenge for ourselves, but also for Oregonians to understand the role that we play and the support that we provide. And that it's an open door policy to receive input and feedback. Whenever you receive input and feedback, sometimes you hear stuff that makes you uncomfortable. That's okay. That's okay. How can we learn from that? And when we get that feedback, what are some of the things we can do to, is it something that we can address? Is it change we can make internally? To have those conversations internally, and to then be able to lean into creating solutions. When we talk about our measures for environmental justice, it shouldn't just be the number of meetings attended and looking at internal policies. It should be the number of meetings we're having with partners, and then looking at the actionable objectives or goals they set out for us, and then having that conversation about what can we actually implement. And then that comes back in internally, talking to the team. What can we do? What is not necessarily our role? What's a stretch goal for us? Sometimes it's what we do, sometimes it's how we do it, and understanding that piece of it. And then how many of those are we following up on? Because we can kind of stay within a bubble and measure ourselves based on what we think we should be changing. But truly, to do DEI work and environmental justice work, we have to be listening and understanding the perspective on how we do our work and what we're doing. And then we have to be leaning into making those changes. So some of the work we've done on the OWEB board, and previously when you served and now as you're serving, we're talking about internally with OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So the big thing between different parts of the organization is knowing acronyms. That was always a challenge. Yes, I remember going from profession to profession and people would throw out an acronym. I'm like, I know what that means. And then it was like, no, that's what that meant in a different profession. So apologies for throwing out acronyms. But we've been exploring, and I've been really pushing the board to lean into the DEI work internally and our team internally, and then also leaning into not just our traditional partners, but our non-traditional partners. Those are some of those opportunities to grow as an organization, to achieve, building those relationships. And I know, because I've got some of those relationships already statewide. I've been to all 36 counties. I know that each one, we have similar challenges and we have very different challenges, different perspectives. So that getting out there and listening, and it wouldn't just be me, it would also be our team, and really leaning into encouraging the team to do that and see that as a valued thing. Measure ourselves based on how much we're engaging with the community and learning from the community. And then transparency is really important. When there are my view, and this goes back to the work with the staff, is praise in public and criticize in private, or coach in private, is when we're facing challenges, let's have those internal conversations and figure out how to message, how to tell the story of what we're doing and what we're trying to do. When we're successful, talk about that. When we're not successful, acknowledge it and talk about how we're going to try to make that change. I think that's true within an organization. I think that's true externally as well. And again, this goes back to the clear expectation the governor set out about how are we improving our customer service, our internal customers, our external customers. How are we as government listening to the community, hearing concerns, and also speaking with one voice? So that is a key piece of the communication, is understanding what we need to address, talking about what we can do, and having those conversations first internally, then with our other state agencies, being very engaged with the governor and her office in terms of understanding how we address these things, and we're transparent about both the successes and the challenges that we're working on, and how we're also speaking with one voice as Oregon government. That's a real important piece of that. And that's why this role is so important, because the director, understanding the different work that needs to be done in each of these fields is really important. You need to have that understanding of that core base and what we're trying to do and the challenges of that. But you also have to be able to be that in between, that the top manager in any organization, between the policy and the public expectation and your team. And that's not always an easy place to be, because you're wanting to both protect your team and support them in doing their good work, and also being able to hear from the community and hear some of those challenges. Any regulatory agency is going to be challenged. It's tough work, because ultimately you're in the position of saying this standard has to be met. And some people embrace that and some people don't. But how you accomplish that and how you work together and message that as something, the value of that work is really important. Is really, really important. That's that piece between going at the and versus or, that adversarial role with folks, and doing everything you can to build up partnerships. Those who are receiving permits, those who are violating permits, are our external customers. And those are opportunities to build partnerships by showing the value of our work and the overall charge that we have as an agency. So those are some of the real key pieces, I think, to looking at how you achieve the agency's goal. But it's also dealing with frankly the politics of it, and it's politics with a small p. Everyone knows I've run for office before. That's politics with a big P. That would not be my role. You all are the policymakers. And having served as staff, having served as a manager, having served as a policymaker, I understand all those roles very well. When we serve on OWEB, it's not the top role, but there's policy that we can set. When you're staff, you're not setting policy, you're implementing policy. As a manager, you're implementing policy, and you're also communicating with policymakers so they understand some of the challenges of implementing it. You're sharing ideas on ways to move those policies forward, but also figuring out how we communicate effectively the policies we're trying to implement. To give an example, in December, you all, to further the environmental goals and to reduce the impact that this agency can have on climate change, talked about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with vehicles. That's a tremendous opportunity for partnership with rural communities, chambers of commerce in rural communities, because what does the Chamber of Commerce want? They want folks to show up and hang out and buy things in town. So, often the initial response on some of these policies will be urban versus rural, or it will fall into that political realm. But understanding that realm, being comfortable and not intimidated by that realm, being able to understand how the dynamics of that realm flow are critically important to bring in the partnerships and to understand the pressures on each of the individuals or the entities and then ultimately trying to help people be successful. I'll give a shout to the Condon Chamber of Commerce. They do some really cool and innovative things. Working with them to make sure they get EV stations so that people passing through the area and then know that they have those stations with electric vehicles can stop off. It's good for the small community. It's a really cool community if you haven't been there. It's good for local business and it's good for the environment. We've got to look for those win-wins. And so those are some of those opportunities, I think. And then mentioned about time. I first want to ask, are there any follow-ups? Because I was concerned about getting through all the questions. So I did kind of rush through. Have any of that either you asked or someone else asked? If you have follow-up questions, I would invite those so I could speak to them.
Yes, commissioners, let us know if you do. Go ahead.
Chair, I'm
Offer them.
the chair.
No worries. Vice Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair George. I appreciate what you've been saying about relationships and the work that needs to happen there. I think just given the body work, and I realized earlier I said 300 staff, it's 300 million budget, it's 800 staff. So
Yeah, I was not going to correct.
A large staff. And I think a question I just had is, how do you create that room for staff, given the context that the agency is in, to work more collaboratively and build those relationships with stakeholders to be able to more effectively do the work?
Well, again, it starts with understanding the barriers from their perspective, and then also maybe sharing some perspective. What I would see is having meetings around the state, kind of town hall, and it can be done in partnerships with the natural resource agencies. The lead person in that setting for DEQ would be the lead staff member, so that they're also, the community partners are also seeing their role respected. But really providing that opportunity to hear feedback and then having a separate conversation with that staff member around and the team, like, you know, whatever the issue was, is how, what did we hear? How could we address it within their current construct, or what are some of the things that can be looking at? And then also letting that individual be the lead on it. I think it's really important for to support the leadership of our frontline staff. Our frontline staff are the face of the agency. Our frontline staff are the local experts. That's something I feel very strongly about. Again, it comes down to respect for their work. And it's sometimes tougher for folks in areas where being part of a regulatory agency creates more tension. They will have insights in the community. They will have relationships in the community that need to be understood. You know, if you look at the High Desert Partnership out in Burns, the place-based planning they've done, they brought together diverse people, diverse perspectives, and a lot of different agencies and organizations are involved to make sure that DEQ staff have the time to be part of those engagements. So whether it's a direct conversation with DEQ and the community, or staff as part of those larger conversations to build relationships, to hear the issues in the community, that part's really important. And then also to the understanding that in some settings, doing this work is really hard. It's easier in urban areas. There tends to be more support for it. It's tougher in some rural areas. There tends to be less support for it. How does that individual feel supported in that tension and crux between the face-to-face that they have with folks, you know, either someone being regulated who's not very happy with the result, or you know, with different perspectives in the community. Talking about climate change, that's something that's readily an easy conversation to have here in Portland. We talk about language. When I'm in rural parts, I talk about wildfires. I talk about flooding. I talk about drought. People are smart, people are savvy, but the language we use and how we look at either this idea and this larger challenge we face, or the tangible results of, show respect for the community, show an awareness of how communities communicate. Again, I had been encouraged after doing a lot of work in different communities by folks who essentially said, look, you do this well. Can you show us how to do it? I actually set up this training, and I've done this training for I actually started Blue Mountain Community College out in Pendleton, but I've done this training for organizations across them. Open door policy. So it's always welcome. Someone walks in, it's always, and helping people both prepare themselves for sometimes difficult conversations, but also engage in those conversations and to get outside our own bubble. It's the biggest criticism I hear of any government agency. Get outside of your own bubble. It's true sometimes within professions. It's definitely true with government. And so the showing up piece is really important because you don't know what change is needed until you really listen.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Schlesser.
Thank you. So I really love everything you've said about meeting people where they are, listening, understanding, speaking the common language. I think that is essential to the work that DEQ does. I also recognize that there are some realities around staff capacity, and staff doesn't have typically a whole lot of flexibility within their schedules. And so I'm just wondering how you would set expectations around prioritizing different staff obligations alongside the need to be listening to and responsive to communities and other stakeholders.
Just one moment. I'm going to pause here really quickly. That's a follow-up to which question, Commissioner?
Oh, it actually kind of applies to a lot of the responses. So I don't
Yeah, Chair, respectfully, I could come up with 3 different questions that's a response to the comments I made.
And I have no doubt about that, that your role here and mine are a little different, right? So
Yes, ma'am.
let's take a look at that, because the one thing I just want to be sure of is, again, that both, all questions that we ask are going to be the same for each candidate. And so that's one of the things we have to be sure of. And again, I bet you the case can probably made, but I just want to make sure that if the question is asked, I know what the answer is. So let's take a look at that.
I think probably 4, question 4.
Yeah.
That's very fair, I would say. Large workforce made of many different disciplines and how those apply to DEQ and its varied programs and expertise. And that, of course, relates to employee retention. Okay, well, point well made. We will allow it.
Well, I could say, question aside, hypothetically, one of the things I think I missed on question number 4 was speaking directly to how we would work with staff expectations with limited bandwidth. And this is actually true too with the ARB, the agency requested budget that went in. The governor's budget came back about 5% below. And so there's going to be some belt tightening, and that is now the agency's budget. It fully recognized the governor's budget is now the agency's budget. And so making sure how we work within that. So this point of, for all staff, there's more work than staff have bandwidth for, because there's such a demand of the agency. So the question becomes a couple things. What is most valued and highest priority? What are some of those changes that looking at what we're doing well and continuing that work, and then some of those opportunities for improvement based on the feedback we're getting and understanding some of those. If we're talking about truly setting the stage for success in our DEI work and environmental justice work, it requires us to be able to spend some time and energy leaning in and listening. And that will have an impact on some of those other areas. Yes, we need to catch up on permitting. And so we also want to look at some of those processes and how we're allocating resources and prioritizing resources. But there it is. Thank you, Stephanie. But also, how are we making space for that? And so part of that comes into the having a conversation with the team on, what is urgent and what is important. And how do we distinguish, knowing that we have limited resources and we have more demand on our time than we have resources? What are the things we want to focus on now? And what are some of that planning, that longer term work we need to do? Part of this opportunity right now is to expand our own understanding of our customer base, internal and external, and exploring some of that analysis between that compliance to enforcement piece. What are some of those opportunities to really learn, can we do what we're doing better? And I can tell you when I was in talent, again, a third of the homes and businesses burned down. the city had the structure, the permitting structure that was in place was intended to review a couple houses per month. There's no way that you can take that rate and apply it to the desperate need to quickly rebuild. And so this actually relied on my planning background to sit down with the team and look at our processes and how we could do process improvement on meeting the objective of getting our permitting done. And we came up with some really creative solutions. If it's those solutions, that also then involves a conversation with our labor partners and making sure that that still falls within our agreement, that make sure it's something that's doable. But there are process improvements we can do to make some change. We also need to better understand some of those expectations, both the governor's expectations with new standards around, maybe new standards is not the right word, but a higher expectation, really taking customer service to the next level. What is that? What does the governor see as what that means? How do we have that conversation internally? How do we not spread folks so thin that there's burnout? But some of these community partnerships also help to recharge. I mean, some folks really enjoy this work, and it actually was seen as part of a plus to that work. And how do we support people in that? So there will be some trade-offs made, though. You can't just expand and do more and more work. And so that's a real clear awareness and figuring out what we're trying to accomplish, how we do that. And then going back to our outcome-based management system, outcome-based management essentially is the concept is you show what you value because you measure it. And it's a human tendency to lean into what's being measured. And so looking at some of those internal measures and say, what are we valuing right now? And what we value going forward in the long run may be different from what we value for a period of time. So we can do some of that internal reflection or internal recharge and then set the stage to go out and be more effective in, I don't want to say be more effective, because I really respect the work that staff is doing, and they're going above and beyond. It's really exploring some of those opportunities to engage. And sometimes we'll find out it's going really well and we're right on track. And sometimes we'll be hearing that we could be doing some of these things a bit differently. And so I think having a period of time to go through that learning and making time for it is really important. I mean, this is true for planning processes in general. I mean, doing the emergency planning and in the long-term planning, that kind of work always gets put off because of the urgency of now. And so striking that balance between doing some of that preparation, because I can point you to many communities who will tell you that wildfire preparation is something they now take seriously, didn't have time for it before, but it's here and it's coming. And it's almost that same concept of whether it's a physical hazard like wildfire or internally, if folks in the organization are not feeling supported, to make sure we're leaning in to make sure that support is happening, because your team needs to feel supported and internally strong to have the impact you want to have. The one other thing about some of that work and some of the benefit of doing that work is you also find the opportunity to leverage other resources, be it with our other natural resource agencies within the state, or also our community partners. There's a lot of work that our community partners want to be doing and leaning into and working with us on that we have opportunities to explore. So if we spend a bit of time focused on that, it sets the stage for making sure we're on the trajectory we want to be on. But it does absolutely involve an awareness of trade-offs and trying to figure out what is the most important thing to do now. And then just one other point I'll mention in terms of past experience with large agencies. The large agency where I was serving as a policymaker and overseeing essentially the manager and the city attorney had almost 1,000 employees, had 10 bargaining units. And so actually having a conversation with one organization that is representing staff is a real luxury, I think. And then the challenge for that organization is within that organization, how do they incorporate all the different concerns employees? But there's the direct work with the labor representatives and the workers representatives, which is I have profound respect for. And there is the still listening on the ground and hearing some of the other things that arise, because that's that accountability piece to your internal customers.
We have 5 minutes remaining. Jamie, is there anything that you want to share as we approach these last 5 minutes? Doesn't look like we have any other follow-ups.
I actually want to thank all those, yourselves in serving commission roles. I know this is additional time for you, and that's that commitment, but really the DEQ team for all the work they've done over the years to really help protect our air, land, and water. I finished high school in Southern Oregon, and I remember rafting the Rogue and running on Steens Mountain and really appreciate and understand how valuable this place is. So many people who move to Oregon, the environment and our natural resources, the air, the water, it's a fundamental part of our identity. Of course, it's our health, it's our economy, it's our cultural heritage, but it's also very much our identity as Oregonians. And this organization is in place to protect that. So literally the work that frontline staff do every day is legacy work for the state. And policymakers, it's important to step in and play this role, but to really know that people who come to work every day, and whether it's sitting in front of a computer and running those things through, or being out in the field and helping with the rebuilding process, that's legacy work. And it's really just the profound responsibility that this agency has is something that it's a real thing of honor to work for this agency and to be able to do this work. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Some of the other work that I've done, my commitment to doing this work goes back to when I was back in school. My master's thesis, and I focused on my civil engineering degree was my first degree with a focus on geotechnical designing drainage systems, and so some of the work that's being reviewed now. But my master's thesis was on how a program that protected drinking water, municipal drinking water, and the ag economy in the area where where the watersheds were. And that I've had that commitment and that interest going back to my early years of trying to figure out how we both protect those resources and protect the local economy and respect the folks who are doing that work day to day and bringing those resources forward. I think, again, making sure that we are keep doing what we're doing well and leaning into those, exploring and then leaning into those opportunities for improvement. And that includes our DEI work and includes our environmental justice work. The and conversations rather than the or conversations of how we can build partnerships, because there is an interest and a commitment across our state to really do this work well and protect our environment, because there's so much pride in it. And so being a good partner to those folks, and then making sure we're listening to all Oregonians. So bringing those relationships, that's something I would be so honored to bring to this team and to the work that you all do. And understanding the impact that this organization has, making sure that people understand the value of the work and lean into that being a partnership. I think those are things that I really want to be a part of, and things I've done before and would bring to the conversation. So with that, I think I want to again express thanks for that, and then also to say lastly, with a new governor and some clear directives, how are we both reaching out to our external partners, but also working in partnership with the other natural resource agencies, because the integrated water management plans, some of those overlaps, and even the emergency preparedness, DEQ has an important role. Economic development, DEQ has an important role in all these. And so making sure we're being part of that partnership will help the team and also help the state move into the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for spending this time with us. We covered a lot in 75 minutes. And we appreciate your time with us today and your application. And we'll look forward to talking to you before too long.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, so we've got
We have a break. Yes, we do. So Stephanie, I think probably the appropriate procedure, right, is we're going to probably pause the recording for a break, and then we will be back in a little less than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair George. The recording will be stopped during the break and we'll reconvene when we are back at 11 a.m.